Welcome back, everyone. So in this lecture, we're going into the next phase in the class, where we start looking at movements in the 1950s and 1960s that in some ways inform a contemporary discourse on participatory art and socially engaged art. So for today, we're going to look at the really important movement coming out of France, though it is international. It's in the name, right? So you also have Dutch artists, you have Italian artists, you have Danish artists. So we're going to look at the Situationist International, which started between the Lettrist International and the Cobra artists. So with this group, what's interesting with them is in some ways more on the theoretical plane, the ideas that they brought forth. And as we're going to talk when we meet this week, they did do certain works, or they did have certain strategies that are in some ways participatory, but they have an uneasy relationship with the public. Above all, as you'll hear from the bishop reading, they had maybe even more than the historical avant-garde, this sort of air of superiority and being above the normal everyday people, even though their work had to do with trying to revalue or make everyday life more interesting again, which is something they would have shared with Dada and Surrealism, two movements that they were definitely indebted to. So we're going to look at the Situation International, and I'm going to give you a broad overview of the important theories and some of the important strategies that then when we meet we'll go into more depth together. So I like starting with this quote, which is from Guy Debord. So Guy Debord is, if André Breton is sort of the head maestro of Surrealism, Guy Debord was the somewhat authoritarian leader of the Situation International. And by that I mean he really had a lot of say as to who was in, who was out. And if you study the history of the SI, and I'm just going to say SI from now on for short, if you study the history of SI, you'll see that Debord just constantly keeps kicking people out, and by the end of it, he's basically the only person left, making these quite incredible films in the late 60s and early 70s. But we're not quite there yet. And so this is a text that he wrote from 1957 towards the Situationist International, and it's a wonderful quote because I think it should still interest us. It's in many ways this quote challenges us still today. And when we read it, we're gonna already know what he thinks about the aesthetic experience, or what it is to be in front of an art object, or what art can do, right? This is no longer a passive conception of art, and it isn't even a conception of art anymore in some ways, though that's something we can debate. So he says it's not a question of knowing whether or not this interests you. So that is fundamentally the question that most people have had about art for centuries. Right? Is this painting by Titian interesting? Does it interest you? Does this Jackson Pollock interest you? It's always as if you're the passive audience, spectator, consumer that has to be pleased. It's almost like a consumer service aesthetics or something like that, right? That's always seems to have been the question. Debord turns this on his head and he says, don't ask whether or not these things interest you around you, but rather ask yourself if you yourself can become more interesting under different conditions of cultural creation. So there's an activation of the spectator here. There's an activation of the audience, and in some ways like a turning the tables, where now all of a sudden you are the one who the spotlight, the focus is on you, on whether or not you're as interesting as you could be. Right? So this is an important reversal, and it already tells us a lot about what he expected art to do, what it couldn't do, and ultimately what he expected the audiences, like fellow human beings around him. It was almost as if becoming more interesting, living more interesting lives, undergoing interesting experiences. That was the aesthetic experience, rather than making some sort of object, making some sort of new object. This is not quite what the SI was all about. So you can see why already they're important for these participatory strategies that we're tracing along the 20th century towards the contemporary. And so when we talk about Debord and when we talk about SI, we can't avoid talking about this very important book that Debord wrote in 1967, so a full decade or so after the beginning of the Situationist International, of SI. And that's a Society of the Spectacle. And this has become, it's been for a long time now, a very, very important book for cultural theorists and for artists. This is still read today. It's more or less every graduate student will at some point read parts of Society of the Spectacle. So it's a very important book. And it's still a timely book, even though he writes it in the 60s. It does seem to have certain things to say about our contemporary moment, and it certainly informs the discourse of participatory art, especially starting in the 90s. Once we get there, Debord, his ideas are going to come back. So it's presented as a book of theses. You have different points, 1 through various numbers of various chapters. It kind of builds on itself in this sort of aphoristic way. You get like sayings in some ways, so much short statements. And I'll give you just 2. Though if you're interested, go check out the book, and I think it's readily available online. It's just so famous now. So this is the first line of the book, and it's probably the most famous line from the book. The whole life of, so it goes like this: the whole life of those societies in which modern conditions of production prevail presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. All that was once directly lived has become mere representation. So it's that last line that you hear a lot. So the idea of a spectacle, of spectacles, in this case, this is different from mass spectacles of the Russian Revolution. What he means by spectacle is the phantasmagoria, the whole image complex of consumer culture. Think of this as, I don't know if anyone has ever seen The Matrix. You likely have. It's very, 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 very popular. The Wachowskis, they were actually influenced by Debord in this book specifically, and another theorist that was influenced by this book named Baudrillard. And so the spectacle in their sense would be this alternate reality that's not quite real. In some cases, not real at all. It's just image, and nowadays it's just data. But yet we mistake it for being real. We mistake it for being like the social lived space of our everyday lives, right? So the Matrix in those movies is like the spectacle, right? Something that you need to get unplugged from because it's sort of lulling you into this consumer culture of images. This is what Debord is against. He's against the spectacle. And why? And he says it very, very directly here. All that was once lived has become mere representation. So according to Debord, our everyday lives, like the authentic social moments that we might have with other people, in society, in cities, in politics, and whatever it is, where once they used to be direct, like you actually had human-to-human interaction, right? Now it's all fallen into just pure representation. Everything in some ways is mediated by images, and of course by technology. And for Debord, this would be above all film and television. But for us, of course, today we have to have the internet, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So this is a big part of his theories, and you can see how this already gets us towards some pertinent ideas that have to do with participatory art, right? Because if you have a later artist who agrees with this, who thinks that we live our lives in this sort of complacent saturation of images that are actually fake, and like real social situations where we've sort of extricated ourselves, then an artist who wants to get people together again in some sort of convivial, social, participatory work, he's countering that, or she is countering that, right? She's trying to create, again, a directly lived experience between human beings, right? So it's very clear, I hope, why the Society of the Spectacle, and especially this first thesis, has been so important. But I do also want to give you the fourth thesis, because I don't want you to think that this is simply, we have images on one side, we have the spectacle on one side, stupid Hollywood movies, stupid advertisements, commercials, all these things, right, that we live with in our everyday lives. That it's not that we have that on one side, and then we have, where we have our friends and we have our significant others and we have our families and whatever, and like we have our authentic social relationships. What Debord is arguing is that even our social relationships between our significant others or our friends or our family, because we're so saturated in the spectacle, those too have become mediated by the spectacle. So the fourth thesis is really important. He says the spectacle is not a collection of images. Rather, it's social relationships between people that is mediated by these images, right? And so, I mean, we can give, there's so many examples of this. So like, if you're in a relationship, your conception of what it means to be a boyfriend or girlfriend might very well be mediated by all the movies you've seen that are rom-coms that have to do with being a boyfriend or girlfriend, right? So De Boer would say that in some ways, even with your significant other, there's this image, there's this gap between you, this inauthentic gap where you're kind of acting, or you think you're supposed to be acting or performing a certain role that's been laid out for you in this social complex of images. That then is mediating your relationship. And then there's this sort of inauthenticity. It's like you're just assuming this role, right? Rather than really trying to figure out what it means to be with someone else, right? I mean, this would be the De Boerian line of argumentation. De Boer would have made a good couples therapist, probably, or maybe not, actually. So there are all sorts of images, all sorts of examples I could give you, right? De Boer, he's writing this in the 50s and 60s, so here are some examples of advertising from the 1950s and 60s. If you're interested, a philosopher named Roland Barthes wrote a book called Mythologies, where he goes in and analyzes all these things, the way these advertisements offer up new myths for us, and we take them on. So here we have a certain understanding. This is an advertising for Omo, which was a French. It might still be around. It was a French advertisement for laundry detergent, right? But this is selling much more than laundry detergent, right? It's selling it's showing a certain type of maleness. It's showing you that this guy with this cigarette and this nice clean white shirt. But above all, I think our critical antennas go up here, and then we start to understand, well, this is also offering up something about gender roles, about the relationship between male and female, right? Which then can be assumed by society. This would be De Boer's argument. So then the relationship between men and women, and here it's normative between men and women, in some ways is conditioned by this advertising complex, right? So this is a clear example of advertisement. This one too, like it's a soft drink. We could, I don't want to take too much time up here, but we could go in and offer up a reading of what this means. First of all, the idea that drinking probably a sugary beverage will make you happy, and consuming this product in some ways is going to make you happy, and this athletic like young lady. So there are all sorts of ways in which this image conditions the viewer, and then this one, which I'm always horrified by. This pig who's cutting himself and offering himself up to his audience, to a consumer. This has a certain way of conditioning consumption as well, in very obvious ways, and in this case more specifically about the consumption of meat and of animals. Right. So there are all sorts of examples that we could go in and do a De Boerian reading of the spectacle and how it conditions us to think and assume certain things, right? It mediates our relationship between an actual living thing. In this instance, right? Like what is a pig, right? This image mediates what a pig actually is in its real life. And there are all sorts of examples we can give. So for De Boer, this was largely television and advertisement, but today I think we would be remiss not to point out that for us now the spectacle is much closer to the Matrix than De Boer could have ever known. He dies in the 1990s. Today we're mediated by images and by data to such a degree that it's actually kind of scary. Where in some ways we have our economic, political, and social existence are set up as accounts. are set up as, in some ways, avatars for us. And we start to sort of assume these roles, right? They start to actually inform the way we live our everyday lives, right? I can think of people getting plastic surgery so they look better on the camera or on selfies, right? This is a clear instance of the spectacle holding great weight and holding great power, making incursions into material reality, right? And I haven't watched this yet, but this is a documentary that I think it's on Netflix now. That's a lot of people are talking about the social dilemma. So I'd be interested. I'll probably put up the trailer alongside this lecture, so you can check out the trailer, and maybe if you have time, watch the film. If you have a Netflix subscription, I'm sure I'll end up watching it when I have time in a moment, because so many people are talking about it. But I have a sneaking suspicion that this movie, from judging from the trailer, which I did watch, has a lot to do with this idea of the spectacle that Debo is talking about, and the way in which the image complex and this consumer complex, and the way in which the internet, the online world, actually conditions our social lives, our everyday lives. I think it'll probably be really pertinent to what we're trying to understand. So check out the trailer at the very least, and if you have time, watch the movie and let me know if I should watch it, if it's any good. Okay, so let's go to the art. Let's finish up by talking about the art, right? So I've set up the sort of theoretical apparatus of the Situationists, especially through Debord. But what role did traditional forms of art play, right? Like surrealism, like Dada, in some ways this movement starts more in literature and in poetry. But there certainly are artists and architects that come along for the ride. But they have a very different conception of art. One that's much more within the legacy, the lineage of Dada. And so Debo and the Situation weren't interested in making art. They weren't interested in like creating new objects. And sometimes I think about this with art making today, like especially with global warming and all sorts of ecological crises that we face. Do we really need to make more objects? Do we really need to make more art? Can't we conceive of art in some other manner that would not simply just produce another object in the world? This is debatable and likely quite controversial in the art world, but an interesting one, and one we'd have to think through. And so the Situationists weren't interested in making more objects. They were interested in making situations. This is where Situationist comes from, right? Making everyday life more interesting again. And not just simply more compelling and more interesting, right? Rather than having this humdrum existence where you work, you do the same thing every day, and you really don't tap into your creative or intellectual potential. They want a life that's much more ecstatic, that does tap into this potential, but they're also Marxists. Keep this in mind. They're very much on the left, and even more so than Dada and Surrealism. They will try to be part of the class struggle and these large scale manifestations that we see in the 60s, and we're going to talk about this today, especially May '68, in which the Situationists did play a role. So they're much more interested in working with everyday life and making situations that would be more interesting rather than making objects. So it's very clear why the Situationists, we have to talk about them in this history of participatory art that we're tracing in this class together. And so there are two telling examples, and I think Bishop talks about one of these, the second one, of what the Situationists thought art could do, like how art could still be used if we don't, without making new objects. So one comes from a story from the uprising. There were very monumental revolutions in Europe in 1848 and 1849. So this was in Dresden, where there was an uprising that was about to be put down. So these were revolutionaries, and there was an anarchist that was among the revolutionaries, where they were facing the royalist army to put down their uprising. Bakunin, he had this idea. He said, let's go into the museum and get the most valuable painting we can, the most cherished one, Raphael's Sistine Madonna, which looks like this, very famous. You've probably seen this before. I think greeting card companies have cropped these guys out and used them all over the place. Those little cherubs. But in any case, he said, let's get the Sistine Madonna, and then let's put it on the barricades. Like, so when I think it was the Prussian army, when the Prussian army comes to kill us, to defeat us, like to put down our uprising, let's take one of their most valuable cultural objects and put it on the barricades. And why would they do this? Well, to use it as a shield, but not as a shield like a shield that's strong and will, deflect a bullet or whatever, or a saber, but its rarity and its value within like a bourgeois history of art would hold the opposing army hostage. Like they won't fire, right? So Debord loved this story. He said, this is how we should be doing art. We should use art for revolutionary purposes and to make life more interesting and to defeat, these bourgeois consumer values that's taken over everything, rather than like try to make a beautiful painting, right? So that's one example, and he loved this. They didn't just as a historical record, they didn't do this. They decided not to do it, but as an idea, Debord loved it. This, however, did happen. This was in Venezuela, and these were the Armed Forces of National Liberation, where at some point there was an Impressionist and Post-Impressionist show that came from Europe to a museum in Venezuela, and one of the first times that these works were shown. And so the Venezuelan Armed Forces of National Liberation, keep in mind the history of Latin America in the 20th century is one that's steeped in repression, military dictatorships, and in many cases democracies that are overturned through military coups, oftentimes with the sympathy and help of our country, of the United States. And there was violent repression, right, of anyone who wanted to resist these powers. And so this is what they were a part of, this resistance in Venezuela. So they decided to go to the museum and take these 5 paintings, and they stole them. And then they said, in the press or through some communique, they said, we're going to give these paintings back if you release our hostages, if you release prisoners. It's a very sad story because they get found and then they get killed. So it doesn't work. They get assassinated. But Debord loves this story because again, this is using art as like a cultural cachet towards political ends. This is taking sacred important objects for European bourgeois art history and holding them hostage for political ends. Right? So he loved the story. So these two stories give you an indication of what the Situationists thought art should be like. And they themselves had 4 strategies. 4 strategies that we should know. So the first is the dérive, all of which they would hope would make life more interesting again, would create interesting situations, right, rather than simply more art objects. So the first and probably the most famous is the dérive, which can be translated into drifting. And it was a technique of walking through places and sort of letting yourself just wander, most often through the urban cityscape. So we're not going to talk about this too much because this is going to be a major feature of our presenters this week. But I do want to bring it in. The other is psychogeography, which is related to the dérive, which our presenters will also likely talk about quite a bit. And this would then be after you've done your dérive, after you've wandered around the city, let yourself be taken over by the city. Then you see, well, how did it coerce me? What were the moods? What were the affects? What were the psychogeographical, psycho being mind and geography being like location? How did the place I just visited affect me, right? And what did it mean to be in an actual living space? Maybe even places I don't normally go, rather than just staying at home and watching a film or being on the internet or something like that, right? So that's psychogeography. The third is unitary urbanism. And this is the most ambitious thing they had, which was, in essence, to use art and especially architecture to construct situations in the urban landscape that would make the urban landscape more dynamic, more interesting, less exploitive, and would lend itself to everyday life as being creative. So I'll give you an example of that. And then the fourth was Detunimo, which Bishop does talk about in your chapter. So it's good that I raise it here because it might be confusing if one doesn't know what the word Detunimo means. It's a French word, Detunimo, and you would probably translate it to turning something around or turning something on its head. Or you can think of it as like a form of sampling, of taking something, a pre-existing thing somewhere in the world, taking it and then updating it for your own purposes, using it and altering it some ways, and using it for your own purposes. And the Situationists certainly did this. So they had a really fancy way of describing this, the integration of present or past artistic production into a superior construction of a milieu. That's just like a really, I have to say, a somewhat pretentious way of describing something that's actually more simple, which is you take something from the past and you take it and use it for your own means. So think of like Duchamp taking Mona Lisa, Leonardo's Mona Lisa, and putting a mustache on her. That's a form of détournement, right? So we'll look at examples of that. So derive in psychogeography, I'm not going to talk about it too much because again, this is going to be a big part of our presentation. But again, a dérive would be to wander in the city with no clear plan and letting yourself drift. Dérive, it can be translated as drifting. And then afterwards, you would do a psychogeography. You would almost like analyze your dérive, your wandering, to see how the city worked on you and how you experienced it, right? So this is clearly a publicly engaged work, if not necessarily a participatory work. But again, we can debate that in class. So this is Debord's Naked City, which I'm sure we're going to look at when we talk this week. But it's a very famous image from the Situationist International. As Bishop says, like these don't have a very lasting concrete legacy because these were ephemeral works. Some of them were basically, could have happened and then never been recorded, right? So this is one of those nice instances where you almost get this map of Paris. You get this map of Paris that in some ways has been changed through the dérive, all these different possible ways you could wander throughout the city. So again, I haven't really explained this map fully because I don't want to steal the thunder of our presenters this week. So I'll leave the dérive and the psychogeography for a fuller discussion when we see each other. But I do want to give you some examples of the last two of their important strategies. Unitary urbanism. So this is to use architecture and urban design to make a more playful, engaged, and interactive cityscape. Right? This is almost the conception of the city as a participatory work of art, where the public could now use a city, live in a city in a way that's much more human, much more playful, and much more creative. Right? So there was a wonderful film that came out, it's very French, and it's from 1967, and there's hardly any dialogue in the whole movie. It's quite incredible, but it's very famous, very well known, in the top in all sorts of great lists of films of the 20th century. But this is Jacques Tati's Playtime, and I always like to show the trailer because this is 1967, the year Debord writes The Society of the Spectacle, and what Tati is making fun of here in his movie is this city as a very unfriendly, inhuman place. Like the modern city now has lost consideration for what it means to be a creative, sensitive, affective human being. We're social beings that need creative outlet, that we need to have time to think. We can't just simply work and be cogs in an urban machine, right? So Tati, in a very playful way, makes fun of this. And if you're interested in this, if this trailer piques your interest, I highly recommend watching this movie. It's great fun, and it shows you what a more gentle, comical critique of like this new hostile modern city could be like, right? So I'm just going to show you the trailer real quick here. it's a totally fantastic film. And it shows you the main character, Monsieur Hulot, who features in a lot of Tati's films. He's completely lost in this highly regimented, very kind of cold and technological urban landscape that he finds himself in. And so with the Situationists, this is what they were trying to work against in many ways, right? So you had someone like Constant, who he was never able to actually make these, but he was an urban, basically an urban planner, urban designer, and architect who dreamed up of going into cities in Europe. So this is Paris, that he called New Babylon, and started inserting new things into the landscape, things that people could interact with, that they could use, that they could engage with, that would be more ludic, or ludic means playful. And so these are all models of things that again, on a scale that they were never able to actually implement, because you need to have, this is the scale of city planning here. But there are mock-ups of what these things would look like, and maps of what these interventions in the city might have looked like, which is hard to get our minds around, like through a maquette, right? What would it mean to go through a city where you don't just go down the ways in which the city regiments your movement, but the city has more possibilities for you. This is very interesting to talk about now during this pandemic that we find ourselves in, because the city is even more restricted and regimented today, for safety and for getting a handle on this pandemic, rightly so. So it's very interesting. It's very hard to get our minds around of what would it mean to have artists come into an urban landscape and start rearranging things and start placing things that would be in some ways interactive. So this is within the legacy of participatory art. This is probably the most pertinent as far as actual practice, which again they couldn't implement. But some contemporary artists have done things like this, which we will talk about later on in the semester, right? The other interesting thing we should point out is that this is during the 50s and 60s, the heyday of May '68, which were these mass protests, which was incredible because it's one of the first moments in history where students and middle class, the middle class and the intelligentsia, they actually went into solidarity with workers, with the working class, with the unions, and there was this large general strike in France, but in other places in the world too, in Italy, in Germany, in Japan, places in Latin America, and of course in this country, because this was the heyday of civil rights protest. '68 is such a consequential year. And so all of these, some of these strategies that we've been talking about of unitary urbanism, of actually using the city and engaging with it and using it in ways that you wouldn't normally use it, the protesters actually did this. So like making barricades with the paving stones in the street, or using cars as shields, right? In some ways, this is a form of the situationist unitary urbanism, of actually using the urban landscape against, in this case, the political protests. So this had a lot to do with decentralization and workers' rights and so on and so forth. But of course, in our own time now, we're seeing protests that have to do a little with these things, but of course a lot to do with racial equality and discrimination, and quite honestly, the police state that we find. We definitely live in a form of a police state. So there are similarities between the protests in the '60s and ours in the current period. So the last example, last strategy that the Situationists use that we talk about is Detunimo, which you'll remember is a form of turning something on its head, using something for different means, right? Which I said was like, it's almost like sampling in music. Like maybe an electronic music takes something from a Beethoven symphony and puts it into an electronic track, and makes it updated, makes it makes it different, right? And uses it for their own creative ends. The Situationists would use Detunimo for more radical political ends than that, though, of course. So again, like using the Sistine Madonna by Raphael as a hostage or as a shield in a war, that would be a form of Detunimo, taking something from the past and using it in a different way. So someone like Asger Jorn, who was a Cobra artist, who was part of the Situationist International before he got kicked out for being basically too much of a painter. He did this. He would go to flea markets. He wouldn't paint these paintings. This would be like just, this kind of popular kitsch painting of a guy looking over looking over Paris from a railing, and then he would go in and make these dribs of paint and sometimes these cartoonish sort of figures on top of it, and that's where the détournement comes in. He sort of goes onto this pre-existing material and updates it with his own scribbling and his own scrawls, and then at the same time, he also seemed to be making fun of abstract expressionism and abstract painting and informel painting, which was the abstract painting of Europe at the time. So not only using this old sort of middle class bourgeois painting from a flea store, from like a market, like a flea market, but also making fun of the highfalutin art world of the time, right? So this is a clear instance of détournement. And the Situationists also had a journal that came out, and part of what they would do in this journal would be détournement. So they would take captions from advertisement, things from cartoons or like comic strips, and then they would replace the bubble captions to put more radical sayings in there, more political sayings. And this one's a very famous one. It's this woman, she's holding her face, and clearly it's probably from like a romantic comic or something that has to do like a soap opera kind of comic. So this probably said like, "Oh Brad, why did you leave me?" kind of thing, right, in the speech bubble. Well, the Situationists then replaced it with a critique of the spectacle, a critique of this image complex that they were critiquing and against. And they have her saying or thinking, "My thoughts have been replaced by moving images." And this takes us back to the beginning of today's session. This is a really beautiful, perfect definition of the spectacle. The idea that your thoughts are no longer really yours. Your thoughts come from an amalgam, from like a mixture of all the things you've seen and all the things that have been hoisted upon you through the internet, through what you've watched, through the movies you've seen. So much so that maybe your own self in some ways is conditioned by all these characters and stories that have been sold to you, along with the products that come with them. Right? This is the Situationist critique of consumer society and the spectacle. Okay, so I look forward to talking about a lot of these ideas in relation to participatory art. Again, the Situationists are a bit more at the level of theory, of ideas, than actual practice. Although I think when we talk about the dérive in psychogeography, it will fit and suit our purposes for this class. And there's a reason why Bishop begins with the SI in the next phase of her book, which is in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Okay, everyone, be well. Talk to you soon.